Thanks for tuning in to tonight's event, sponsored by the Menard Family George Washington Forum at Ohio University. Tonight's guest is Frank Dikötter. He's here to have a conversation about China and the world since 1949. And you'll all have a chance to ask Frank questions if you look at the Q&A function at the bottom. Send us your questions and we'll work them in to the discussion. Frank's been Chair Professor of Humanities at the University of Hong Kong since 2006. Before coming to Hong Kong, he was Professor of Modern History of China at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, where he also got his PhD. He's a publishing machine, published over a dozen books, including a People's Trilogy about modern China, Mao's Great Famine, won the 2011 Samuel Johnson Prize, The Tragedy of Liberation, shortlisted for the Orwell Prize, and his book on the Cultural Revolution, shortlisted for the PEN Hessell-Tiltman Prize in 2017. I could go on a long time listing Frank's publications and his honors, but I think maybe we'll just get straight down to asking you some questions. So tonight, just want to be able to have a conversation about kind of how to think about China and the world today, but that would involve thinking about where China has come from, right? So where should we begin if we want to think about understanding modern China? Where in history should we begin?
That's a very good question. How much time do we have?
Long as you want.
Let me speak at some length. I think it's the key question. Where do you start your story? I mean, a story must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The end we don't know quite yet. But the beginning, I think there are three mistakes that people make when it comes to understanding China today. And the biggest one is probably to go back all the way to, the Han, the Tang, the Song, the Ming, the Qing, pick any one of these dynasties. And the key issue there, one that afflicts our understanding of the People's Republic of China, is that there is a confusion between culture and politics. And this is probably one of the biggest issues we have, not just for students, but also teachers and many of my sinological colleagues, is that the moment that you say China, the term culture comes to mind. But it is not about culture, it's about politics. So from that point of view, let me take another minute to explain what the politics are. If you take a very broad approach to modern history, then it would seem to me that the key point really is 1917, of course, with the Russian Revolution. From that point onwards, the entire 20th century can be split more or less into two camps. One is parts of the world where there is a pursuit, however difficult this may be, of the separation of powers. In other words, you build up or try to build up an independent judicial system. Your executive power is separate from your legislative power. There are checks and balances, a free, open press, a thriving civil society. These are the foundations of democracy. On the other hand, there are parts of the planet inspired by Lenin, followed by Mussolini in Italy, Adolf Hitler, and many others, who believe that all of that is just rather ineffective. What one needs is a monopoly over power. These are referred to as dictatorships. So the struggle really is between a democracy and a dictatorship. If you wish to understand China today, then the Soviet Union is a good starting point. We will not do that. So that's one mistake, the focus on culture rather than politics. I think the second mistake would be to start in 1949. Of course, we will do this. Most of the talk will be in 1949. But that is, of course, sidestepping a tremendously interesting and inspiring half century. The entire first half of the 20th century in China, the Republic of China, the empire collapses in 1911. One forgets that China becomes the first republic in Asia. It has it has 10% of its population that votes. There is a very concerted pursuit of the separation of powers, great amounts of effort put into building up a legislative system that is separate from the executive, a very open society in which students and ordinary people go abroad and bring back elements from Japan, United States, Europe. A thriving society which tries, although it doesn't always succeed, to promote the very basic freedoms that most of us would understand: freedom of association, of movement, of speech, of religion, of course. So to start in 1949 is to sidestep that tremendously interesting era. And then I think the third mistake would be to start in 1978 with the third plenum, when the propaganda machine in Beijing tells us effortlessly and ceaselessly, Deng Xiaoping becomes the man who opens up 40 years of reform and opening up. 40 years of reform and opening up. So we start with 1978 as if the entire era under Mao doesn't matter, as if there are no very basic structural continuities from 1949 till today. So these, I think, are the three mistakes that people tend to make. Nonetheless, we'll start in 49.
Okay. What was, just before we get to 49, what was China's relationship with the world before 49? You talked a little bit there about the Republican phase in Chinese history. What's the world that was lost in 49?
The world that was lost was a democratizing world, was a country that aspired to achieve the very highest standards in every field, from democracies like France, Great Britain, United States. And you have to remember, in the 1920s and 30s, not every part of Europe is a thriving democracy. Japan, same story, also fascist dictatorship in the 1930s. Yet all along, until the country is invaded by Japan in 1937, there is an attempt to, for instance, sign treaties with the League of Nations, apply the highest possible standards of treatment to its prisoners, to schools, to education, to medical care. There's some 40,000 students who go abroad and acquire degrees in Japan, Europe, United States. School children will read about George Washington and Edison and Darwin and other figures that they believe represent the world that they wish to join, an open, free, democratic world, which is not to say, of course, that the party in charge from 1927 onwards, the Nationalist Party, the KMT, Kuomintang, it's not to say that the Nationalist Party is not without some very, very serious flaws. To some extent, you might say it is more comparable to, say, Portugal under Salazar than a more open democracy as you would have in the case of Britain, France, United States. But still, while journalists may get killed, as they do under Putin today, there is no attempt to stifle, for instance, the press. It wouldn't be possible in the first place. I think Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Nationalist Party, is very well aware of the danger of a monopoly over power. He says it very clearly: we do not wish to become like the enemy. The enemy is the Communist Party of China.
So, good to know. So, one of the things that's interesting about modern historians, no one asks in early modern Britain, what are your ideological priors when you study the 18th century Church of England? But they might ask that about somebody who studies modern China. I mean, one of the things in looking up your stuff, you can't buy Frank Dicotter's books on the mainland of China. So I guess I just wondered, how did you get into studying Chinese history? What were your politics as a student?
These are two separate questions, really, but they could be related. But the real reason why I got on a plane and went to China in 1985 to stay for 2 years is because I couldn't get a scholarship to go to the Soviet Union. I was a great fan of Dostoevsky. I did a double degree in history and in Russian. I only did Chinese as a minor, but my parents had moved to Switzerland when I was 12 years old. And as a Dutch citizen, I couldn't apply for any of the scholarships to go to the Soviet Union. Now, like some of my teachers, of course, there was a suspicion at the time that if you do Russian and Chinese, you might be a fellow traveler, shall I say. But I never really had any true profound political convictions. In fact, if anything, certainly in high school, I had more interests in Jimi Hendrix. I played electric guitar, had long hair. More interest in that than in politics. I couldn't simply understand where that conviction came from on the part of some of my friends. They seemed to be so committed to a particular political cause. I just didn't understand where it came from. It seemed to me to be more a matter of emotion than reason. In other words, I was already aware of Plato's paradox. I know what I don't know. And the more I knew, the more I became aware of how little I still know. So that's really it. It took me, in fact, a great many years to understand that when it comes to politics, most of my colleagues are really barking up the wrong tree, whether as young people or senior professors. The debate seems to be endlessly about capitalism versus socialism, and either for or against. But there is no such thing as capitalism. Every market is regulated, otherwise there wouldn't be a market. It's not possible. Capitalism is an invention of Karl Marx. It's the way he describes the enemy. What you have, and I think this is what I pointed out earlier on, is not a division between a right and a left, or between socialism and capitalism. What you have is a division between countries that build up a separation of powers, in other words, democracies, and those that have a monopoly over power, in other words, dictatorships. You cannot have a market without private property. You cannot have private property without a legal system that actually defends it. You cannot have knowledge about the market without a free and open press with all the legal guarantees that backs it up. So the whole debate about the merits of capitalism versus socialism is an absolute waste of time as far as I'm concerned.
Well, let's talk about the person who established a dictatorship in 1949 or soon thereafter, Mao Zedong. What's Mao like? How does he come to power? How did dictatorship come to mid 20th century China?
It's if we talk just about 1949, then again the temptation would be back to go to 1921 when the Communist Party of China is established. But the problem is that for many, many years, membership of the Communist Party of China is in the low thousands in a country of 400,000 people. So the very people who back the Communist Party, Lenin, but also Stalin, the financial backing, as well as, of course, the ideology and, of course, the tools to acquire power. They suggest having a united front. In other words, they suggest that the communists should work hand in hand with the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek. But all of this really doesn't make an awful lot of difference. By 1945, after a horrendous war in which millions perish, the communists still are a very minority party in the hinterland, there are pockets of that huge country that are controlled by the communists. So what really makes the difference? What happens? How does Mao Zedong become from a small leader in the hinterland, somebody who has a quarter of humanity in his under his power? I think the key is Uncle Joe. Lenin, Stalin, 6th of August 1945, Hiroshima is erased in a blinding flash of light. 2 days later, on the 8th of August, Stalin, thanks to military help from the United States, since, of course, the Soviet Union is an ally against Nazi Germany, has been able to keep a very powerful army in Siberia, which is 1 million man strong, despite the rush, of course, to occupy and reach Berlin before the other Allied powers. So on the 8th of August, 1 million soldiers from the Red Army cross into Manchuria on the way to Korea to fight Japan. And they occupy the entire north of China. They do not go away, everything to the north of Beijing. They hand over the countryside to Mao Zedong and his ragtag army of guerrilla fighters. They established some 16 military academies and helped transform Mao Zedong's army into a formidable fighting machine. All along, the Americans abandoned their own wartime ally, Chiang Kai-shek, and the nationalists. Truman imposes an embargo. George Marshall, the very man who came up with the plan to build up Western Europe, is also the man who in China forces Chiang Kai-shek to go back to the negotiating table with Mao Zedong. So by 1948, the communists are so strong that they start encircling cities. Changchun, a city in the north, is besieged during a period of about 6 months. Some 160,000 ordinary people are not allowed to leave and die of hunger. Once that city collapses, other cities are no longer willing to undergo the same fate. So they hand over the keys to the advancing communist troops. Like dominoes, these cities fall, compelling Chiang Kai-shek and the remaining nationalists to flee towards Taiwan. In October 1949, the red flag goes up over the forbidden city. In other words, what the communists describe as a liberation, 1949, is really the result of a very long and brutal civil war.
Okay, so no Uncle Joe, no Mao, right? So you need Stalin is the prerequisite.
Yes,
for
of
Mao's
course.
Success.
You go back further back, you could say no Uncle Joe, no Adolf, but right. That's a different debate.
Fair enough. We'll talk about that maybe later on.
No Stalin, Mao.
About
no
9 years.
No
We'll definitely talk about Kim Il-sung in a bit. So about 9 years into Mao's dictatorship, the Great Leap Forward happens, and the title of your book is Mao's Great Famine. And I guess I wondered what was the Great Leap Forward did it achieve, and reading in your Mao's Great Famine, a lot of people died. My understanding is you think a lot more people died than most scholars do, and I just wondered how you determined that, how you went about determining it.
Yeah. So 2 questions. One, what was it? What was the inspiration behind it? And secondly, how did I come up with the numbers I advance, which are at least 45 million people starved, beaten, neglected, worked to death. So 2 aspects. The first aspect about the Great Leap Forward, where does it come from, what does it mean, is, surprise, it's Uncle Joe. Uncle Joe. What does he do? What is communism? How do you bring it about? In 1929, Joseph Stalin comes up with a plan which, to some extent, you might say, still corresponds to what the Communist Party of China is doing today. You take from the countryside resources, grain, butter, meat. You sell it on the international market. You use the foreign currency to buy all the advanced equipment and entire plants to import back into the Soviet Union and kickstart modernization. Now, Mao has exactly the same idea. Take the food from the countryside, sell it to the Soviet Union this time, and buy advanced equipment to fuel modernization. But something else happens too. In 1953, Stalin dies. For the first time, oddly enough, Mao feels that he is no longer restrained by someone else. Stalin, oddly enough, is the only one who could somehow hold them back. So what Mao wants was to accelerate the pace of collectivization, which was already happening at the time. He wants everything larger and he wants it faster. Now, the second key turning point is not just the death of Stalin, but 1956, when his successor Nikita Khrushchev, in order to celebrate the 40th birthday of the Bolshevik Revolution when Khrushchev first denounces Stalin in 56, and then a year later, 57, invites all the key leaders of the socialist camp to come to Moscow, celebrate the Bolshevik Revolution. There, Khrushchev says, we will overtake the United States. And Mao says, you will overtake the United States. We are going to produce more steel than Britain within 10 years. So this is it. This is the challenge. Who can go faster? Who can go quicker? Who can reach communism? Who can overtake the communist camp? The solution is what Mao calls a great leap forward, and its tool are the people's communes. The people's communes are gigantic collectives into which pretty much everything is collectivized. It more or less transforms ordinary man, ordinary women into foot soldiers in a giant army. That's the vision. If every man, every woman could somehow be deployed in a giant army that works day and night to transform the economy, then China can catapult past its competitors. So the people's communes are seen as the golden bridge from socialism into communism. But of course, in the fact, what happens with radical collectivization is that China becomes a sort of gigantic labor camp. People are not allowed to cook their own food. Their pots and pans are confiscated. Food is distributed by the spoonful in collective canteens. Everything is collective. Collective canteens, kindergartens, dormitories. The whole notion of private property is still there, but extremely faint. There are no incentives left for farmers to do the work. Since there are no incentives left, they must be whipped up in one drive after the other by the local cadres on the ground who are responsible for fulfilling this target after that target. So you can imagine what happens. It's the same as a giant labor camp. People are no longer fed properly. Those who don't work enough do not get enough food. Those who speak out or fall asleep during a meeting are banned from the canteen and starved to death. So after a year or two or three, the numbers become enormous. The second point of your question was the numbers. How do we know? Well, you can't. It's the Communist Party, but there is a contradiction. On the one hand, you can't because there's no bean counter there to note every person who disappears or vanishes. The statistics are all twisted. We'll come back to that later on. But on the other hand, of course, this is a culture of secrecy, and every culture of secrecy keeps extremely detailed records. So what I did is that I discovered enough in the archives to give me a sense of overall proportion. For instance, a beautiful handwritten letter from the man in charge of the Public Security Bureau in the province of Sichuan. You may have heard of it. Sichuanese food, very spicy. So this province is about twice the size of France. And in that letter, he announces to the boss of that province that under his reign, during the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 62, some 10 11 million people have died unnecessarily. Well, that is in the archives, never published, of course. There are other reports. There are demographers who set out to find out what happened in this part of a province or another. So when you have all that evidence, which is very partial, and you compare it to the official statistics, then you realize that it's about twice that size. So what I did is really take some official statistics and then just double it. It's arbitrary, I agree. But the result is not so much a fixed number, which we will never know. I think it's rather silly to talk about 23 million or 38 million. There's no such thing. It's a specious sense of precision. But I do say that probably at least 45 million people just vanished, died.
So, and died of what, right? Of starvation or of...
So this is the key point. The term famine is very passive. The term famine is even more passive in some European languages, Dutch and German, or Hungersnot in German. It conveys a sense of people helplessly waiting in the absence of food. But there is plenty of food. It's being taken away. Sometimes the food rots along the key motorways as there are not enough lorries and not enough petrol to procure it. The state itself can no longer transport the food as the whole country more or less implodes under the weight of that catastrophe. But the key point really must be that people are not starving to death, they are being starved to death. Food is used as a weapon. It goes back to Lenin. Those who do not work will not eat, And that's exactly what happens. You get work points. If you happen to be somebody who doesn't have enough work points, you will not get enough food in the canteen. If you speak out, you fall asleep, you do something seen to be politically controversial, you come from a bad class ground, you are deliberately being starved to death with a ban on access to the canteen. Pregnant women, children, the elderly are all affected, as there seem to be somehow surplus mouths that take away food from people who are actually able to fulfill their quota and contribute to the regime. People are treated as mere figures on a balance sheet, as numbers to be somehow manipulated. As Li Rui, a secretary of Mao, said it when he reviewed my book. He was already 90 years old or so. He put it in Chinese. He put it very well. I know that not everybody in the audience will speak Chinese, but he said the key reason was, in Chinese it goes like this: 不把人当人, 不把人当人, to not treat human beings as human beings. That's exactly what happened. So it's not just people starving to death, it's also being neglected deliberately, or being worked to death, or being beaten, tortured to death in the case of maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 7% of that total. Several million people are literally beaten to death. You will not work, I will whip you. You continue to not work, I will make you work naked in the middle of the winter. I will make you kneel on broken stones. Your family steals a sweet potato, I will punish you in front of all the others. It becomes a giant, again, labor camp. And we tend to neglect that aspect of the famine. We tend to think, again, in terms of something quite passive, but it's about politics again. It's not about the weather. It's not about absence of food. It's about politics. Think Khmer Rouge, think Cambodia, think Pol Pot. That's really the equivalent.
So,
of course, Pol Pot is greatly inspired by Mao Zedong.
So a couple questions are coming in the feed, and I pair questions together as we've done. So sorry about this. So the one is, what did Mao know, and what are Chinese students today taught about the Great Leap Forward? In other words, did Mao know that tens of millions of people were dying as a result of the Great Leap forward. And what do Chinese students in schools today, taught about the Great Leap Forward?
Well, I don't know. This is one of the characteristics of a dictatorship, of a one-party state, is that you simply don't know what people think. This is true for the Soviet Union, it's true for Nazi Germany, it's true for Maoist China, and it's true for China today. You can tell me that Germans loved their Führer, but the reality is that about 100,000 ordinary Germans were put into concentration camps in 1933 because they spoke out against Adolf Hitler. So by 1934, an ordinary German knows to keep his mouth shut. Now it's the same for all these regimes. When you see people cry when Kim Il-sung dies, these are crocodile tears. People do what they have to do. They offer a performance. So we just don't know. Methodologically, we don't know. Nonetheless, of course, you get an inkling of what might happen. And beyond that, besides what people might know or not know, it is crystal clear that the People's Republic of China is a state of enforced amnesia, in the sense that immediately after Mao's death, the debate about the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution is shut down in 1981, when the party has an official resolution that describes Mao as being a great philosopher, a great strategist, and a great communist whose contributions are major and whose shortcomings are minor. There's no debate about either the Cultural Revolution or before that, the Great Leap Forward. So that closes off the debate already in 1981. From there onwards, very little is published. There are periods, of course, just before 1989, where there's a frenzy of activity. There are, of course, scholars, students who are very keen to find out more. Every time I go to the archives, at least until recently, there would be a student coming up to me, excited, to tell me about the Great Leap Forward or some other aspect of the party's history. So there's no lack of people who really want to find out. Most of all, I think people in the countryside. So here's a little story. A friend of mine, Hu Jie, well-known journalist, investigative journalism, makes films, or made films in the PRC, went to the countryside where around about 15 years ago, many decades after the Great Leap Forward, where the farmers had erected a memorial arch to commemorate the victims of the Great Leap Forward, with all the names of the victims inscribed on that memorial arch. Well, within days, the public security police came, of course, bulldozed that arch, and for good measure arrested all those who had contributed to it. So the state must repress again and again to try to eradicate any debate, any memory about what happened, but it is not able to do so.
Is the Great Leap Forward, I mean, one of the questions asked, is the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, which we'll talk about in a second, is the sort of ideological impulse for that, is it Maoism, is it Stalin-Leninism, or is it something else? In other words, is Maoism a coherent body of thought? There's the Little Red Book, and in your work you show Mao poses as a kind of philosopher. But is there a there in Maoism?
Well, it's about as profound and interesting a body of work of, have you heard of Ceausescu in Romania? Yeah. Nicolae Ceausescu?
1989.
Ceausescuism. Or Kim Il-sung-ism. Have you heard of Papadoc, Duvalier, to take a dictator who's not communist? On the right, so to speak. I already said there's no such thing as dictators on the right or on the left. They're just dictators. It's a monopoly of power. But Duvalier, Papadoc, as Duvalierism, of course, in Haiti. All of them want to have an ism attached to their name. It is important. Hitlerism, you might say, is the true guiding star of Germany in the 1930s. they see themselves as the ones who contribute not just to the revolution, but who provide the overall framework for it. And this is particularly true, besides Mussolini, Hitler, Duvalier, and those on the right, so to speak, particularly true for parties that proclaim themselves to be Marxist-Leninist. You have Marx, you have Lenin, Stalin. You must contribute to that body of philosophy. You must develop or be seen to develop Marxism, Leninism. So Mao skips Stalin, of course, who he resents, and offers a body of work that leads the communist camp further into the future. So you get Karl Marx, Lenin, and Mao. And what is the essence of it? It will be the Cultural Revolution. We'll talk about it in a moment. But in essence, you can spend time reading the works of Joseph Stalin. I did. You can read some of the works of Nicolae Ceausescu. I did, in translation. You can read some of Kim Il-sung. Trust me, it's not exactly, Hegel or Kant or Foucault or any one other of these dead French philosophers or German. It's not quite the same thing.
So the Great Leap Forward is about an economic Great Leap Forward, focused primarily on collectivization and agriculture, and also you have some interesting stuff about steel. The Cultural Revolution, 66, 76, doesn't seem to be primarily about economic advancement. What's it about? Right? What were its aims? Did it actually achieve its aims?
Yes, it did.
What were the aims?
You would have to know the aims, exactly.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
To know the aims.
Yeah.
So here again, Uncle Joe, massively important, dies in 1953, denounced by Khrushchev in 1956. As Nikita Khrushchev details all the crimes committed by his erstwhile master, Joseph Stalin. It is the start of de-Stalinization. De-Stalinization is already used in 1956 by some of Mao's colleagues to suggest that there ought to be collective leadership, not a cult of personality, that Mao should somehow step back. His thought, we just talked about Maoism, it's called Mao Zedong thought, is deleted from the party charter at the end of 1956. Mao is fuming. Not only that, but by 1962, as the extent of the disaster of the Great Leap Forward becomes apparent and is discussed within the ranks of the party, Mao is wondering whether he will undergo the same fate as Stalin. Will there be de-Maoification? And most of all, will it happen while he is still alive? You must understand, every dictator is always fearful of a coup in the back. A dictator, by definition, seizes power. He's not elected. He's too weak to be elected. A dictator seizes power and is afraid that someone else will seize it from him. It's always a him, by the way. So then the question really is, how can Mao prevent someone or a clique appearing that might constrain him or take power away from him? Now, here Mao describes Stalin as being more or less 70% correct and 30% wrong. He never explains what the 30% is that he thinks Stalin, where Stalin made a mistake, but I think he knows very well. Stalin failed to spot Khrushchev. Stalin promoted Khrushchev. So Mao simply taking what he thinks are his enemies, Deng Xiaoping, Liu Shaoqi, and putting them in jail is not going to help. He doesn't know who could come and undermine him. So the true purpose of the Cultural Revolution is to pit people against other people, have family members, neighbors, colleagues denounce each other, and most of all, have ordinary people attack and criticize members of the Communist Party. In this sense, the Cultural Revolution is unique. I'm not one to use the term unique. I think all these regimes are very much alike. They copy each other, they're inspired by each other, and even if they're not, they make the same structural mistakes. There's a particular logic to a monopoly of the power. There's only that much you can do. But Mao is unique in actually allowing ordinary people to criticize members of the Communist Party all the way to the top. The purpose, of course, being that all of them, at one point or another, get the purge, and all of them have their powers taken away, leaving Mao somehow right at the very top of that machine, in control of a game in which the rules change constantly. He can rescue a close follower, a minister who's been loyal, and he can throw someone else to the dogs. That's the real purpose. On the surface, of course, it is not called a cultural revolution for nothing. It has to do with culture. Lenin, 1917, Bolshevik Revolution, takes away the means of production from the capitalists and, of course, collectivizes them. But the capitalist ideas, bourgeois ideas, are still there. So this is what explains why Khrushchev denounced Stalin. Khrushchev has been brainwashed by capitalist bourgeois ideas and is leading the Soviet Union back onto the road towards capitalism. In order to prevent that, culture must be destroyed. The bourgeois, feudal, superstitious ideas must be destroyed and replaced by a good proletarian ideology, which of course means Mao Zedong thought. Mao badges, Mao writings, Mao emblems, Mao posters, you name it. So on the surface, what Mao does is contribute to this whole body of theory with the Cultural Revolution, making sure that by undermining all these bourgeois ideas, China, and by implication the entire socialist camp, will never walk back onto the road of capitalism. But he uses it to undermine his real or perceived enemies, basically creating a willed chaos over a period of roughly 10 years.
So I gather you think that Confucianism has no role in this. Somebody in the question asked, well, what's the role of Confucianism in the Cultural Revolution?
Who's he? Who's Confucius?
Exactly.
It's not a chat with an ism at the end, is it? Yeah, I'm joking. Yeah. No, sorry. It goes back to what I said in the beginning. This has nothing to do with culture. It's everything to do with politics. It has to do with Stalin, may have to do with Lenin, may have to do with other great dictators of the 20th century, which is not to say, of course, that neither Mao nor others actually spend a great deal of time reading Confucius or other classics of Chinese literature. But the real object of study, whether Mao reads Confucius, the legalist school, or about guerrilla warfare, or whether he reads the works of Stalin, what they are studying is power. That's the object of study. Dictators are students of power. They read about power, how to acquire it, how to keep it, how to undermine it when your enemies have it. They do so by reading, but they also do so by observing others.
There's a bit in your work where you say, well, look, in the Great Terror of 50-51, Mao set a fixed rate of killing, like 1 out of 1,000 people, right, should be killed in each sort of locality, right, and then some people got too zealous. Was there anything like that in the Cultural Revolution? And I mean, not to be gory, but I mean, what is the toll of human suffering in the Cultural Revolution? So you think around 45 million, somewhere in the ballpark for the Great Leap Forward. Is the scale of human loss of life similar in the Cultural Revolution, or is it something else that's destroyed?
Some of my critics, not that I read them, but some of my critics allege that I exaggerate the numbers. My answer is always the same. If a foreigner like me based his work on archives which are open, what do you think might be in the archives that have not been declassified? What do you think would be in there? Would it be much better? But the real proof is that I do not think that a great many people died during the Cultural Revolution. In fact, I put the number at 1.5 million over a period of 10 years. So you have to understand that the Cultural Revolution is not about loss of life, that the campaign of terror, which unfolded for about a year after October 1950, was about targeted violence with a killing quota of 1 per 1,000. The Great Leap Forward did not necessarily aim to destroy human lives, although it did. But the Cultural Revolution is not about loss of life. It's really about loss of trust in other human beings. It's about loss of trust in family members. It's about trauma. It's about people being forced to denounce others, people forced to lose any sense of integrity by doing things, saying things they would never have wanted to say in the first place. So it's not really about loss of human life. It's again that sense that you have to say things that you wouldn't want to say.
So 1976, late 76, Mao dies and everything gets better, right? I mean, that's the story, right? Dies and China's liberalized and it's all good. I take it that's not, you don't exactly buy that line. So if China's not liberalized from 78 on, and you mentioned that early on opening remarks, what happens to China sort of between, say, 76 and 2012? What goes on then?
It's a very long period, so we can look at it. How much time do we have? I have to be slightly long in my answer, but
sure.
There is a structural issue, which is the continuities from Mao and then post-Mao, and then there is the more sort of detailed nitty-gritty history, which I will not do, although I wish to highlight a number of key points about how and why the economy changed after Mao's death. In fact, it changed before he died. And that's a key point I want to make in a minute. But first, the structural continuities. We hear, again, all sorts of terms used to describe the 40 years of reform and opening up. That's the official term used to describe this entire era from 78 onwards. The regime rather conveniently skips the 2 years from the death of Mao to the third plenum, 78, when Deng Xiaoping becomes the key person. But never mind that. The term capitalism is used, the term market is used, all sorts of words. Orwell said this. You must be very careful with simple words because they always mean something very different in a dictatorship. And one of these words is actually democracy. Of course, every dictatorship paradoxically describes itself as a democracy. It's called democratic centralism. You have to be very careful with words. But at the risk of boring some of your students, what is Marxism? What is a Marxist economy? In a nutshell, it really is that the state has ownership over the means of production, or if you have students who do economy, it's called the factor market. So let's say that there's a little factory here, and there are things that go into the factory, and there are things that come out. Everything that goes in is called the factor market, the means of production in Marxist parlance. That means, what do you need to produce something? You need land if you wish to grow a potato. You need labor. You need capital, money to set up your factory. You need raw materials. These are the means of production. On the other hand, what comes out are commodities. The means of production are in the hands of the Communist Party after 1949 and are still in the hands of the Communist Party today. At no one point ever did any one of the leaders after the death of Mao, whether it is Deng Xiaoping or Hu Yaobang or Zhao Ziyang, sometimes described as great heroes until they were ousted, the one in 87, the other in 89. None of them at any one point ever said that they would contemplate the separation of powers and releasing the means of production to the private sector. Never. In other words, the party has insisted all along that there ought to be ownership over all of that. Today, or 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, the capital belongs to the banks, which belong to the state. The banks belong to the state. The land belongs to the state. Major industry belongs to the state. Raw materials are very much determined by the state. Of course, there are billionaires, but as you and I know, occasionally they will disappear from view and then either reappear on CCTV to confess to their crimes, or in prison. Their assets now belong to the state. It goes back to what I said earlier on about the protection of private property. There's very little of it in the PRC. In other words, the structural continuities are very much there. These are people who, the moment Mao dies, are out to build up what they think is true socialism. And that means not the Cultural Revolution, not the Great Leap Forward, but what they had in the 1950s. That's the goal, to go back to the future. That's the goal. Now, how did they get there? I don't want to go through the entire last 40 years, but a key point must be that even before Mao dies in 76, ordinary people, the majority of villagers in the countryside, are fed up. They have been starved during the Great Leap Forward. They have had to endure the Cultural Revolution. By 1971, when Deng Biao dies and there's a turn and the Cultural Revolution is toned down, Mao reaches out to the United States. Kissinger and Nixon visit. We might want to come back to that later on if you wish. The ordinary people in the countryside realize that the Cultural Revolution has actually badly damaged the standing of the party. That was actually Mao's purpose. It was a full-fledged assault on the Communist Party of China. There are no longer people willing or able to supervise what they do. Ordinary people start undermining the people's collectives, the people's communes. They take back the land. They take back their own tools. They produce what they think would work best on the black market. They use the black market to buy the grain illegally to fulfill the quota to the state. In other words, they undermine the collective economy from below. They wrench back basic economic freedoms from the state. And there's nothing that Deng Xiaoping can do about it, although he tries time and again in 78, in 79, in 80, in 81. He keeps on saying with one campaign after the other, ordinary households in the countryside cannot cultivate the land as they see fit. The people's communes are the structure which we will maintain. Well, the communes collapse in 82, 83. And there's entrepreneurs in the countryside and ordinary people who really create the wealth that Deng Xiaoping uses to rebuild his own party. In 1989, he was strong enough to send in the tanks to suppress his own people. From that moment onwards, it becomes very clear that while ordinary people have been able to wrench back basic freedoms, sell something that you cultivate, grow melons and bring them to market, open a very small factory run by family members. While there are some very basic economic freedoms, political freedoms will not be tolerated and will be suppressed time and again. And it's that difference, that sort of some economic leeway, but a strict political regime that somehow confuses outsiders. They wonder, how can it coexist? One thing you must remember, I'm sorry to go on forever, is that all the money these people make, working quite hard, must go into a state bank. And what do the banks do with it? Well, just imagine if you had an American president who can use all the savings of American people. You could build massive highways, big skyscrapers, huge showcase projects, white elephants. Time and again, visitors, tourists go to China and come back thinking, wow, the highways are better in Lanzhou, Gansu province, a piss-poor part of the world. The highways are better than the ones in Switzerland. What a miracle. Well, that's because they've got all the money to squander on such projects.
Yeah, that is a question. I mean, the post-2008 government sponsored building spree, I mean, I think what you referred to there, if that's analogous to the Great Leap Forward, why hasn't that bubble popped yet?
Yes, so it's a very interesting point. The term miracle is occasionally used to describe what happens after 76. In fact, what is surprising is that a country in which the living standards in 1976 are lower than what they were in 1949, I can come back to that in a moment if you wish, they're lower in 76 than they were in 49 when there was liberation, that a country so poor that has spent decades in political campaigns, wasting human material resources, that it has made such little advance in the years that followed. If you take the per capita gross domestic product as determined by the International Monetary Fund in 1979, China ranks number 126 in the world. By 1999, it is number 121. By 2007, it's number 116. In other words, from 1979 to 2007, almost 30 years, it has moved by about 10 steps up that ladder. So it's not quite an economic miracle. But what happens after the financial crisis truly is a miracle. There are trillions of yuan released after 2008. An amazing amount of money unleashed from the state coffers to keep this economy going. The results of China joining the WTO 2001, 2002 also become very apparent. There's a real true leap there, which is quite truly staggering. And they build. This is a constant. Communist regimes in general, the one in China in particular, invest in infrastructure, not in people. To this day, half of the population in the countryside is extremely poor and extremely poorly educated. This is no different from the decades under Mao, but the structural problem is always the same. Why do they do this? Why so much investment in infrastructure? In 1959, at the height of the Great Leap Forward, as millions are being starved to death, a number of great buildings go up in Beijing to celebrate the 10 years since liberation in 1949. In fact, 10 buildings go up in Beijing, but of course, every provincial capital wishes to do the same thing. So there are hundreds of showcase projects that go up right bang in the middle of the famine. They are still there. They're still there. Many of them are still there. Great Hall of the People would be one of them. Beijing railway station has been renewed, it's gone. But there is a splurge spent on infrastructure. The same, of course, under Deng Xiaoping, and the same to this very day. Why do these buildings matter? Because local officials are not accountable to the people below them, but to the people above them. So big tangible symbols matter a great deal. But also because the money is there. If you have, as a local leader of a city, of a county, of a province, There are vast amounts of money that your citizens have saved at your disposal, and you wish to outdo your next competitor in building bigger highways, more skyscrapers, a better railway station. How come that bubble hasn't burst? If so much is built on flimsy money, how come it doesn't burst? Because there's always more money available. Because you can keep on postponing the day of reckoning. Why can you do that? Because the means of production belong to the state. Because the banks belong to you. Because you can always intervene to avoid a bankruptcy. Because you can always intervene to somehow keep this extraordinary thing afloat.
Right after the crisis, Xi Jinping came to power, and I wondered if you thought of this administration as, is it an inflection point? If not, what explains, ratcheting up of kind of internal repression after 2013, thinking the Uyghurs? This sort of relates some of the questions that have been coming in the chat. Is the cult of Xi like the cult of Mao? Just your thoughts on Chairman Xi.
Yes, I welcome Xi Jinping for a very simple reason. He has done more than others to destroy the image the regime had built up so patiently. A great many foreigners, possibly a great many people in China, believed, despite all the statements that the regime made, that somehow this regime would have political reform after economic reform. Now, that's the great myth that became widespread after 1978. If you help China with its economic reforms, political reform will follow. It's an inevitability, a little bit like a Marxist law. Capitalism will fail, communism will appear. It's one of these iron laws of history. I never believed in it. As I told you earlier on, I was never particularly convinced by dogma when I was a student, although I did read about the democracy wall when I was a university student. The democracy wall being a very small stretch of wall where students, ordinary people, put up posters in 1978 and in 1979, posters in favor of democracy. Wei Qingsheng talked about the fifth modernization when the regime talked about four modernizations. Of course, by the end of 1979, he was arrested, went to jail for 15 years. That, to me, indicated very clearly that this was not a regime all that keen on having political reform. About 10 years later, I was in Beijing in 1989. That lesson was confirmed to me again. For 30 years, I've watched my colleagues and friends talk about China as if it somehow is on the verge of becoming a full-fledged democracy. But Xi Jinping has destroyed all of that. He's made that iron fist with which China is ruled apparent. And in that sense, I welcome a little bit of honesty.
Yeah.
So the question is it new? Is it a new inflection, or is it something old? As far as I'm concerned, it's all déjà vu. The campaign against corruption started in 1950.
The never-ending project.
Never-ending campaign against corruption.
Yeah.
What else could you do?
So a couple of people have asked in the questions, if you have any thoughts on the fact that a number of, and there was a recent New York Review of Books piece on this by Perry Link, but that a majority of the Chinese citizens in the U.S. actually are largely supportive of former President Trump's policies toward China, and that a number of Chinese dissidents voiced support for Trump after 2020 and after 2016. What do you think accounts for this, and what does it say about Chinese dissidents in general?
A number of presidents rescued the Communist Party. One was Truman, when in September 46 he imposed an arms embargo on Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, while the Soviet Union was building up Mao Zedong and his guerrilla fighters in Manchuria. Of course, it backfired rather badly. He was fighting those very same soldiers in Korea a few years later. And I wouldn't say that Nixon saves China, but he does come in at a key moment when Mao makes a strategic shift away from the Soviet Union to reach out to its enemy, the United States. Of course, people like Kissinger viewed this as some great geopolitical move. But it was based on a major miscalculation. The miscalculation was that the Soviet Union is the key enemy for China, and the United States of America is a capitalist country, and capitalism is doomed to fail. That's the miscalculation. So Deng Xiaoping does the same thing. He sees the Soviet Union as the main enemy, with the long border, of course, with the PRC, and a pretty large army. He reaches out to its two main enemies, Japan and the United States. He visits Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter gives him the most favored nation, which means that China can sell at preferential rates to the American public. Remember that there was a clause called the Jackson-Vanik Clause passed in 1974 that prevented these same tariffs to be applied to dictatorships like the Soviet Union, but it was still passed for the People's Republic of China. So Carter here really comes in to save Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese economy. Now that they can export in great quantities to America, they can earn the dollars they need to buy the advanced science and technology they want to modernize their country. In 1989, this backfires very badly. Two countries stand out for coming immediately to the rescue of Deng Xiaoping. They stand on the rostrum by the end of 1989 in Tiananmen Square above the peace, the gate of heavenly peace. The East Germans and the Americans. Alexander Haig is standing there next to the East Germans. They've come in to rescue him. Then Clinton in 94, again, makes the most favored nation treaty almost permanent. And then, of course, George Bush, who allows China to join the WTO. These are American presidents who have done a great amount to facilitate, speed up the rise, economic and otherwise, of the People's Republic of China. So it could be that in the view of some people, and I have to express myself very, very carefully, because my wife detests the president who you just had, whose name I'm not even allowed to pronounce, but it might just be that there are people in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, even in the People's Republic of China, who believe that Republican or Democratic, there's a whole string of presidents who have fundamentally miscalculated when it comes to the People's Republic of China. There may be those who think what you need to stand up to a bully is another bully.
Fair enough. Belt and Road. There's been there's some questions coming in about something I guess variously known as Belt and Road Initiative. 5G is part of that. Loans to infrastructure projects in African countries. Loans to Italy. Loans to places in the Balkans. How do you see this as part of Xi's grand strategy? Is it part of grand strategy? What do you reckon from history its prospects will be? That's synthesizing a number of questions that have come in.
Yes. Before 1949, China wanted to be part of the world, and the best parts of it, the democratic world. After 1949, China no longer wants to be just part of the socialist camp. It wishes to lead the socialist camp and more generally the world. With the Great Leap Forwards, Mao Zedong thinks he's found with the People's Communities the golden bridge from socialism to communism, making him the leader of the socialist camp, and then ultimately the key pivot, the key historical moment when the history of humanity changes and is ushered ultimately into the communism that Karl Marx had announced. All along, the PRC sees itself not just as a country, but as a leader of the world. So all along, under Mao, under Deng, under Jiang Zemin, all along they've spent vast amounts of human, material, financial resources to cultivate other countries around the globe. Albania, at the height of the Great Leap Forward, as tens of millions of people starve in China, is more or less fed with food shipped to that country. Albania is fed with rice from the PRC for free. So China has always played a dominant role in Asia in particular, as you well know. They went into Korea to fight for Kim Il-sung. They helped the Vietnamese. Of course, they all turned against each other later on. That's what they do. That's what the Red Brotherhood does. But also in Africa, Latin America, and of course, Europe. So none of this is particularly new. What is new, perhaps, is the extent to which people from China are sent abroad and capital from China is sent abroad. And that really goes back to Jiang Zemin, not Deng Xiaoping. So Jiang Zemin is the one who takes over after 1989. And for a decade, he's the one who really works hard at China joining the WTO. And he's the one who comes up with this philosophy of going out. China must go out. There must be people sent out to Africa, Latin America. There must be entrepreneurs. There must be capital, money sent out to go and conquer planet Earth.
So I want to get out of here on two questions. One, again, kind of combining a number of questions that have come in from the chat, and the version of it is, maybe I'd put it, you're pretty outspoken, Professor Dikötter. Do you worry about that, right? As somebody who needs access to Chinese archives, and what is maybe a way of asking it generically is, what are the kinds of pressures that scholars of modern China face, and how do you deal with those pressures?
Well, I'm an old man. I'm on the way out. Most of all, I'm a foreigner. If I would be a young Chinese, Taiwanese, Hong Kong historian interested in the history of the People's Republic of China, I would be very worried. I'm not so sure I would want to cross that border and go into the archives. But you must realize that it's become very difficult. There's no doubt about that. It's become much more difficult for all of us. But things come and go. Things come and go. This is what I tell my students here in Hong Kong. When I was in China in 1988 to 1989, after the massacre, a Dutch anthropologist approached me and said, "Oh, you know, I've collected a lot of material on the massacre in Tiananmen Square, June the 4th, 89. So I said, well, that's fascinating, but I'm a historian. So I will speak to you again in 30 years' time. Here I am. Here I am. Of course, at the time, nobody thought that it would be possible either to study it or to do anything related to history of the People's Republic of China. But things come, things go, things change. Nothing is permanent. So my advice would be to historians who don't have the privilege, as I have, of being both old and foreign. I would say, dig in there, because there will be an opportunity and you will have to seize it. When the archives began opening up around about 2004, 5, and 6, I was in there like a ferret. I seized the opportunity. People sometimes ask me, Frank, how come you got so much stuff? How can you do all of it? My answer is, why are there not more people doing it? If I can do it, anyone can.
So that's for historians, scholars of the thing. There's a question. Get out of here with this. What do you think are the big issues and themes that aren't emphasized and that should be emphasized in the teaching of and the way that people learn about modern Chinese history? You know, what did college professors need to be doing better to teach about modern China?
It's a topic which is extremely tricky to address, mainly because it concerns people who might be considered to be my peers or colleagues. They already resent the fact that I publish so much. Never forget the role of envy. It is what structures universities and the world of academia. Envy is the key value. There is, again, I did say I'm not one to emphasize how exceptional China is. In fact, that's one of the key issues, that we always believe that the moment you say China, there's something different at work. But something is different. And that is that this country closes down to the rest of the world. That's the topic of the seminar. It closes down from 49 to roughly 78. Then a few foreigners are allowed in. Then you have the tanks on Tiananmen Square, 89. Then again, it closes down. And a little bit of opening up gradually, but now last couple of years, again, closing down. This, in other words, is a country that, even compared to the Soviet Union, has been very difficult to work on when it comes to access to evidence. I am an evidence-driven historian. I spend all my day, already as a student, I was fascinated by primary sources, read the memoirs of somebody, or a letter from an ordinary person, or even a list of statistics, anything that is primary. But because access to primary sources has been restricted for so long, it has attracted, whether in anthropology or in economics or political science or history, it has attracted a type of person who is less interested in evidence and primary sources, and possibly more interested in theory and, if I may use the word, ideology. This was the great discovery of students from China when they were allowed to go to Harvard under Deng Xiaoping in 1977, 78, 79. They arrived and realized that all Chinese studies, most people doing Chinese studies in the United States, Harvard, are Maoists. Well, of course they were. And of course they put their own people in positions. And of course, to this very day, there's a great amount of sympathy for the People's Republic of China. There are no enemies on the left. There never are. Which means that the scholarship has been flawed in that it is not based on evidence and primary sources. It's also flawed because it tends to be highly uncritical. And surely the one thing you're supposed to do as a scholar is be critical. This is what we ask of our students, but some of us refuse to do it ourselves.
Yeah.
So in a nutshell, the entire history of modern China has to be rewritten.
No small task.
Keeps me busy.
Well, thanks for keeping us busy for the last hour and a half here. Really appreciate it. For those of you who tuned in tonight, the next Washington Forum event is on Tuesday, the 2nd of March, when Eugene McCarraher from Villanova University comes to talk about his recent book, The Enchantments of Memon, How Capitalism Became the Religion of Modernity. In the meantime, thank you, Frank, for giving us your time tonight. Good night, everyone.